So tell me, Nate, who do you see this podcast going to?
Who do I see this podcast? Well, anyone that wants to listen can listen to it, of course, but especially people who are called to take care of others, lead others. That can be in the church in particular. We'll talk a lot about things in context of the church and relationships to pastors, to people, but also volunteers that are called to shepherd others, to lead others. But it could apply as well to anybody that's a manager or a business owner or even a parent. I think it could relate to anybody that is thinking about leading other people.
I know we talk in Girl Track a lot about everybody's called to be a leader and how Jesus, if we're following Jesus, we're going to be a leader because Jesus was a leader. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of shepherd-hearted things in our lives that can help everybody in their walk of life, and following Jesus and is how we treat others who are following us as we follow the Lord. So I hear you talk. I've been along the journey with you for quite a while now. It's been 30 years. I'm like, as we're prepping for this and grabbing our cheaters, it's kind of funny to go, we've come a long ways since our 20s. But I have watched how you have worked with people, ministered to people, and sometimes it's like, okay, Nate, it's really cool, but like, I get it, but when is our turn? That kind of idea. But I love how you have always cared and looked for others and what God is doing in other people. And so I think it would be good for everybody who's listening just to hear it from the beginning and talk to us about what you feel, your history, the things that you've done in the past and how it relates to being a shepherd-hearted leader. Like maybe start from the beginning of how we started out, and specifically you started out in ministry. Yeah,
we're calling it shepherd-hearted leader. And where does that come from? Well, everything begins with how we were formed or shaped. For me, I have the honor of coming into a family where my mom and dad loved people in the home and at church and everywhere we went. It was as if my dad and mom wanted to help the world all the time, like 24/7. And what I mean by that is my dad pastored for a while when I was younger. Then he worked a full-time job in a manufacturing company, and yet he volunteered in the church, was an elder at the church. My mom and dad had connect groups or fellowship groups that were in our house. My dad would have young men that would come over. He would mentor almost every night of the week. They would eat dinner with the family, and my dad would spend time helping to mentor and disciple young men. And so I just came up around that environment. And then when it came to church in particular, I came underneath great leadership. Our pastor, Wayne Benson, talked a lot about what a true pastor was, and he displayed it. He modeled it for us. I had a youth pastor that his name was Jeff Grinnell, and Jeff loved the students, and he was with them all the time, and he was a true shepherd. He loved to be with people and smelled like the sheep in a sense. And so I came out of that environment, and I was also trying to figure out who I was. And I used to say something when I was a little kid. I was like, I'll never be a leader.
Yeah, that's funny.
Which is hilarious. My mom and dad have told me stories that when they would sing happy birthday to me, I hid under the table. Like I didn't want the attention. And so even when I went off to college, my first 2 years at college, I went for business administration. And I figured I would make a difference in the business world. And that when it came to church, I volunteered as a youth leader. And during those 2 years in community college, when I was doing my business degree, my great love became taking care of high school students. And I finally reached the point where I realized I wasn't happy and fulfilled in the program that I was in. So I transferred to North Central and became a pastoral major. But my deal with God back then was that I'll be a business administrator at a church. I didn't think of myself as speaking or being in a prominent vocal place. And so God had his way of pulling that out of me. So I volunteered at Emmanuel my first week in Minnesota, 1991, and volunteered as a youth leader and just poured my life into doing ministry as a volunteer. And then I was asked to do my internship at Emmanuel that summer and that next summer. And so I did. And that was the summer of 92. During that time, I led a missions trip
Yeah, I remember that missions trip.
Yeah, you do, because you were the female youth leader on that trip.
Yep.
And we poured our life into helping these students have a good experience. And we'll have to tell the stories someday even on the podcast. But the idea of development of my heart, my leadership skills, what they were for, was really formed out of this idea that it was about the students, or it was about the people that I was serving, not about my career. And God promoted me. It wasn't something I chased. And so I was asked in April of 1994 to come on staff at the church right after you and I got married.
Yeah.
And we said yes, and I stepped into that space as an assistant youth pastor for about 18 months, and then I was asked to lead the youth ministry. And while I was leading the youth ministry, I had a lot of mistakes I made and a lot of growth. I thought that I had to be a super speaker, and because all the people I saw were great speakers, and I thought that was what I would have to do, and I was trying to project myself into something I wasn't.
Now, do you remember what Pastor Mike Olson, who was over the youth ministry back then, what he said to you about speaking and
so thank God for mentors that will speak into your life and have the courage to say what they're thinking, because he heard me speak. It was like a Sunday school class that I was doing a sermon in. And when I was done, I was frustrated, I was sweating, I'm sure I wore the people out. And Mike pulls me aside and he said, "Nate, I've never had to say this to anybody else." He said, "But you need to preach more like you pray." He said, "Because when I hear you praying, you are passionate. You don't have to pause and think about words and what you're going to say. It's just natural for you. You need to preach like you pray." And so I don't know that I learned to do that right away, but over time I learned how to communicate, love people, and reached a point in our journey, because we had served under other leaders that were good leaders. Some of those things that we had seen modeled became natural for us to do as leaders. And but then I reached a kind of a limit to that. And I remember as a youth pastor when we had, I think it was a couple hundred students, and I loved everyone. I knew every one of the students. I knew every one of the youth leaders. But I was dreaming for more, and I felt like God said we were going to grow. And in order to grow, God spoke to my heart. And I'll never forget, he said, I'm not going to give you any more students until you take care of the ones that I've already given you. And at that point in time, God began to rearrange the paradigms of how I personally cared for people. I needed to learn to care for leaders and train leaders who would care for those students the way I did. And so it began a journey for me of learning how to develop volunteer leaders to think like pastors, and to lead well, and moving from wherever they were in their journey and how they saw themselves. Most were inadequate. They thought they weren't good enough, and I needed to build them up. And then I also needed to equip and challenge and then release things. And we did a thing, you remember when we...
Win, build, send.
Yeah.
We raised up a lot of leaders and sent them out.
Yeah.
How many people do you think went into full-time ministry out of the youth group back in the day?
Oh, man. It's hard. I have never stopped to really count the number. I know the number of youth leaders that became pastors and missionaries and the like was probably over 50. Yep. I do remember that part of the journey of me learning to equip and release leaders involved being specific. So we took attendance on Wednesdays. Remember you built the Excel spreadsheet for attendance, and felt like we needed to close the back door. Yeah, and what we noticed is that on Wednesday night, all the leaders sat together because the leaders liked each other while the students were off doing their thing. And you got your pot smoking group in the back. There's no leaders nearby, and you got your rebels over in another part of the room, and there were no leaders nearby. So we had to spread the net over the whole flock and actually give.
I have to say, as one of those leaders, like before you and I were together, I hung out with the leaders. It was like so much fun to have a young adult community within the youth group. And I remember when I met you, I'm like, who is that? Is he like a student or is he like a leader? Because you were always hanging out with the kids, so I didn't even know. But and then we figured it out, like that wasn't really a good strategy to help disciple and mentor and shepherd people.
No, and so they didn't know what to do. So I had to come up with a way to help them see it. So we actually took that entire Excel spreadsheet of list of regular attending students, and we put a leader's name next to every one of them and spread the net over the whole flock. And that meant that the 5 superstar Bible memory kids that tithed and went on mission trips didn't have, you couldn't be a youth leader and have 5 different youth leaders say, that's my kid.
Yeah.
We needed to make sure it was spread throughout the youth group. And we learned. Do you remember when I did a youth leader meeting and we did them on Sunday afternoons after church, and we had dinner together up in the cafeteria, or I don't remember when we called it back in the day, it was Fellowship Hall or something. And while we're eating, we set up the sanctuary where the youth group met on Wednesday nights, just like it was a youth group. Our worship team was out there, the lights were on. And after we were done eating, I said, all right, everybody, I want you to go down in the sanctuary and sit where you usually sit on Wednesday night.
Yep.
And everybody went down, and guess what? They sat right by each other. And I said, then I came in and I actually had a chart where I showed the whole room. And I said, now, I walked around the room and said, now notice this whole section of 15 rows. There's no youth leaders here. So not only did they have names on a spreadsheet, but we wanted to apply that in the context of our services. So we actually spread them out. They had assigned zones and areas to sit on Wednesday nights, and they were responsible. Then we went through a service where I literally told them what I expected them to do throughout service. Worship with your eyes open so you know what's going on with the students around you. And if somebody is loud during the speaking, you're the one that's responsible. And the introvert leader had a hard time with that, but we had to coach them up. And then we also supplemented that with leaders in the hallway that were kind of bouncer type leaders, and we call them junkyard dogs, the JYD crew. Yeah. So anyhow, that was a journey of figuring out, not only because I did a lot of things where I cared for students, but I had to figure out how to help others do that as well. And the youth ministry years, really, we grew on that. Of course, after we began to make that shift is when we grew by hundreds of students. And, there were some of our special nights. We had over 1,000 students here, and we had, on average, over 600 to 700 students every Wednesday night. And it was an amazing journey. And that led me to go to North Central, where they called and asked us to come and teach there at the university and teach future youth pastors. And through a process, I said yes. I said yes to the Lord, and went down there, and I spent 10 years at North Central, the first 18 months as a youth focused person, and then the rest of my time for 10 years, I was in the administration and finished as a vice president.
So how did you feel that during that time? I mean, I remember, but maybe those who are listening don't know what you went through, because it can feel like, wow, that's a really cool opportunity to go speak at a college and teach at a college. But it was different when you're leaving one occupation basically to go to a whole different career. I remember being at church, we still attended Emmanuel, and people would come up to me and just say, I believe your husband Nate's going to be in ministry again someday. And I'm like, he is in ministry still. He's just not in ministry here. Yeah. We were speaking and doing things, but it was kind of a lonely time. Maybe you speak to that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, at that time, I never envisioned doing anything different. So it came out of the blue. It was a phone call from the president of the college, who also was my mentor. And he'd said, Nate, I'd like you to think about coming to work at North Central. And I said, no way. And he said, would you pray about it? And I said, I could do that. And literally 3 days later is when we resigned. So it was that clear that it was God speaking to us, not because of the opportunity, but because we heard the whisper. And for me personally, I just said yes, not knowing what I was going to. It felt like Abraham and God saying, go yonder. Well, what does that mean? And you just follow the voice, the call of God. And so leaving that also meant leaving the team, because over 10 years as a youth pastor, we had developed teams of people that were doing the work of the ministry. So all those leaders that I developed, some of them became staff members. And I had a robust team. I mean, we had 3 or 4 full-time assistant youth pastors when we left, and we had 2 TV shows, and we had a master's commission with 40-some students in it, and I had 2 administrative assistants that were doing a lot. So I mean, we had a robust team, and then we shifted to North Central, and it wasn't changing jobs, it was changing careers, because of what we stepped into was the education world that had a different scoreboard for success, a different timeline. My first week on the job at North Central was the last week of the semester, and everybody was packing up to leave. And so and they didn't have an office ready for me at that time, and they were doing building construction. So I went in and I shared an office with 4 people. I didn't have a phone. I didn't have an administrative help. I didn't have a job description. I didn't have anything, and I was just lost. I remember feeling like I was standing on the sands of the seashore, and the tide was going out, and I was left alone. And so during those times, I mean, even like 3 weeks in, they kicked me out of the temporary office I was in, and there was no office, and I officed out of home. And I opened the door, and you know, our kids were young at that time, and there was like 4-year-old Timmy is out there, and that was my new team. And so I felt like alone. I just had to trust the voice, though, through that period of time, that he knew what was best for me. And then I kind of began to find my legs in that new world later on, but listen to the same voice I had when I was a youth pastor.
Yeah, so a lot of times we'll hear you talking about the voice, following the voice, and then also about the uniform, and talk about how the voice and the uniform in this situation going from one to the other.
Yeah, you know, people are interesting. We like rate people on their importance based on what they do sometimes, or their platform or their job. And it's not always healthy. Sometimes we esteem people for their profile, but we don't really know the person. And sometimes we dismiss people that are quality people, but they don't have the same profile, so we might walk by them. And I experienced a lot of that in that transition from Emmanuel as a youth pastor into the college, because I had this word pastor in front of my name. I was Pastor Nate. And, you know, we had our youth group was called JC's Place. We had a TV show called JC's Place. And so there was a profile attached to that, and people had either known us in the church in our youth ministry, they'd known and seen us on TV, that kind of thing. And so my status was related to what I led. And once I let go of that, I lost that honor in some respects, or people's esteem for me. Because I remember even the day after our last day at Emmanuel as youth pastors, we couldn't get a babysitter. And for 10 years, we had no problem. Everybody wanted to help Pastor Nate. But now I didn't have pastor in front of my name, and now it was just Nate. And it's just kind of the way it works. And so when we went to the school, now all of a sudden I'm teaching students. I didn't have the titles of some of the other professors and teachers at the school. I wasn't as welcomed there as I was in the place I was leaving. And so in a sense, I started over at the bottom of the ladder again. Now, the climb is the same in the sense, if you're humble and you walk the route of serving, Jesus promotes. And so over time, I did experience promotion at the university, but it was a longer climb, and it wasn't based on the old factors of what I had led before. And I remember during that time, it was brutal, and I would process with Dr. Anderson, who is now my boss, the president of the university. And I'm like, how do you make sense of all this? Because I would go speak at youth camps and conventions of 5,000 students, and I was Nate, and the former youth pastor still, and then I was Nate, the teacher from North Central. But then I would come back home, and nobody knew what I was going through, and it could feel lonely, and he experienced a lot of that as the president of the university, and in and out of different places. They might have respected him because he had doctor in front of his name, or they respect him because he was a president, but not in every arena that he went into. And he told me a story, and his story has stuck with me. And I've used this in a lot of my messages about the uniform. And he said, Nate, people salute the uniform, not the person. And he gave a story of a younger man who went to med school and got his medical degree, doctor, and yet he in an arrangement with the military. So when he graduated, he instantly became an officer in the military. And so he graduates, and his first day on the job, he puts his uniform on, and he walks onto the base, and people stopped and saluted this guy. And he had never been saluted before. And he's like, what's going on? Well, they weren't saluting him. They were saluting the uniform and his rank in the military. And Dr. Anderson looked at me and he said, Nate, people used to salute you for the uniform that you had, but it wasn't a saluting of you. They were saluting the uniform. And you hung that uniform up and you jumped into another organization. And he said, so you can't find your comfort or your identity in the salute from other people based on the rank. You've got to learn to find your identity in the call of God and the whisper of God and being closely related to who you were born to be. Because the day will come, even if you get higher ranking, and when I left North Central, I was a vice president. And then I stepped into a role as a senior or lead pastor. And in that transition, the reality was people were going to salute the uniform. But if that's your identity, you try to keep it. Or you feel threatened when someone doesn't respect you. But if your identity is in God, then you don't have to worry about whether or not they respect you.
And you did a great job just watching you all those years, embracing the tough stuff. We learned a lot when we left Emmanuel as youth pastors and then you went to North Central. Basically, we did learn who's our friends, what ministry, like you said. A lot of people are like, crying that last Wednesday and going, you can't leave. I'll never be able to live without you, Pastor Nate. And by the next week, they moved on to the next guy. And and they had moved on pretty quick and trying to find a babysitter. But then it gave us perspective, too, about knowing when God calls us to do something, it's not us. And it's not about us. It's about the people that we're serving and not to hold on too tightly. So you traveled a lot and went to see a lot of churches in those years, 10 years at North Central. And you noticed things about people getting attention. Who got the attention? Talk about that.
Yeah, so one of the benefits of being at a university is you're like Switzerland. You're neutral. And you get to observe a broader group of people without being a threat. So I wasn't a threat. Sometimes pastors are gauging their value by comparison with other pastors. But when I was at the university, I didn't have any of that. But I would pop into places.
Would you say, to a threat, they would worry that you're going to hire their staff or something like that?
Yeah. Or even like, how many people do you have in your church? And there's this comparison kind of thing that it just happens. It's not healthy, but it just happens. So anyhow, when I would travel, though, I would speak in district councils and different venues, and I was around pastors and leaders from the upper Midwest. North Central has 11 districts that oversee the university. So primarily I was in and out of those districts. I went to other places in the country as well. But when I would step into those spaces, I observed dynamics of lonely people who didn't know how to care for those underneath them. So if they were a senior pastor, they would have staff underneath them, and they didn't always know how to care for their pastoral staff. So, for example, if I go to a convention, it was inevitable that I would have one-on-one coffee meetings with other youth pastors. And now that I was at the university, these youth pastors were like sharing their story because they felt like it was a safe place. And many of them felt like they couldn't share that same information with their senior pastor for fear of losing their job. And so there's this insulation of core concerns that if they're not dealt with, if they're not processed in a healthy way, they become unhealthy later on. And so I watched and observed that even the rank piece of it, based on your position, determined how free you were to develop yourself or to think about real life issues or family issues and that kind of thing. And even during that period of time, I had finished my master's thesis and I did a project on helping youth pastors be in a peer mentoring group because I wanted to provide safe places for them to talk. It was all signed off by their boss, their senior pastor and everything. But they would process and develop, and they had a trusted, safe place to talk without leaving the church. We wanted them to stay in the church, but they needed to talk about real life issues. And many of them stayed longer than they would have otherwise. Many of them developed a dream for the future, and they had a safe cadre of friends that would help them. And so we did that in several districts. It's still going on in Minnesota. And the idea is to have a safe place for the conversation, not based on rank, but also saying, hey, you might be a future senior pastor someday. Yep. You might be somebody that. So I was very interested in providing space for them to stay in the game without losing heart, because sometimes they never would get picked to take the place of their boss. Yep. Or their boss, senior pastors have a hard time letting go. And so you've got stuck people on staff, not sure about their future. And I kind of leaned in and listened to the stories of people and what their families are going through. The spouses of pastors were, it was a private place of pain sometimes because their spouse, often have been a husband or a wife. The spouse was like, you're in all the staff meetings. You know all the information going on. And meanwhile, we've got kids, and I'm taking care of kids while you're gone all the time. And you're not making much money. And so the spousal dynamic also is a big deal. So it's not just the person and the title. It's also about what was going on in the person's family. So I leaned in on that and listened and began to write about it, began to think about how do I help people at every stage of their journey so that they stay in the game.
Yeah, and of course, back then, you were working with a lot of youth ministry majors who eventually would be in churches, and it was super interesting, I think, to you to help them find healthy churches to go to and have healthy leaders. And so coming out of North Central, God led you and us back to Emmanuel about 10 years ago. Talk about how that history impacted how you lead today.
Yeah, so it's interesting. In 10 years of time, I hit about year number 7 where I thought, I'm never going to be a pastor. I'm never going back to the church world. I've been in the school, higher ed for so long that it seemed like that was the trajectory for my career. And so, I'd started my doctoral program during that time, and I wanted to develop me. I never thought that I would be a president or something like that. I just felt like, man, all my opportunities in the church world are gone. Nobody remembers me as a pastor anymore. Now I'm a school guy. And so, but during that time, God began to drop different things, breadcrumbs, if you will, in my heart and in your heart. I remember you gently asking questions like, would you ever go back and pastor again? And what did I say?
Only if the Lord led.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think we had different things pop up, but we finally got to a point you said, only if it was Emmanuel.
Yeah. Yeah, nothing else would really bend my heart except for Emmanuel.
And we really never thought it was a possibility.
Yeah, and at that time, the founding pastor of the church, Mark Denez, who pastored for 43 years, his son, Dwight, was going to become the lead pastor, and he did. So that role was already filled. And so we didn't even think that was a possibility, but we were trying to lean in and listen to what God was saying. And meanwhile, I was still preaching. I was still traveling. And then the time came when Pastor Dwight, asked me to preach on New Year's Day of 2012.
So the church was open on New Year's Day.
Yeah, church open on a holiday. What an idea. And I remember God gave me a prophetic word for the church in a way that I had not felt in a very long time. Yeah. Like God was stirring me. And so I preached it on that day. They combined their services into one on that New Year's Day. But it was something very personal between me and God. I'm like, what's going on? And that following week, I went out to lunch with Pastor Dwight. And during that lunch, he shared with me that he knew when his last day was. and he was going to complete his term. They had 3-year terms at the time as lead pastor, and that would be in March of 2013. And he said, and my job is to be like Abraham's servant to go find a spouse for his son. And he said, and he goes through the whole biblical narrative part of that. And he said, and so that servant found a spouse for his son Isaac, and he said, but then it was on that person to accept it. And he said, I believe that you're called to be the next pastor of Emmanuel, but it's going to be on you to accept it or not. And at that time, I didn't see it coming and I didn't feel it. I went into consultant mode. I was telling him that's never going to happen. And then we met once a month for the next 5 months. And he said, where are you at with it? And by the time we got to May, I had processed it with you. And it was a long journey for us because we were like, do we want to pick up that cross? Because we knew what it would mean for our kids, what it would mean for our life. And so it wasn't at that point in our stage of our journey where we're like, wow, we could become the path. It was, do we want to do that?
We had more of a realistic view of it.
Yeah, it was more realistic, it's true. And
it still was a little harder than I thought.
Was it? Why do you think?
Oh, it was just being the senior leader. Once you accepted and came back, it was a lot harder on the family than I realized it would be. But keep going.
Yeah.
Keep sharing your story.
I don't mind you talking on this podcast. So by the time we got to May, he turned to me at that meal that I was in with him, and he said, now I'm going to tell the board next month my plan. And he said, they're going to begin to pray about my successor. And he said, I only get one shot to give a name to the board. He said, I can't choose it, but I can give my endorsement. And he said, I need to know if you're in or you're out. And at least for that part of it. And we prayed and said, I'm willing to let my name be talked about in the boardroom. It wasn't in the church yet.
Yep.
Okay, let's go ahead and do it. And one thing led to another, and they met in June, and Pastor Dwight shared with the board what his plan was, and he encouraged them to pray about the next pastor. And he said the next pastor will come from one of 3 places. It's going to come from current staff, former staff, or somebody completely outside that experience. He said the best case scenario is current or former because they know the culture of the church. They'll know how to lead and they'll get us. And he said, I want you to pray about it and come back with a list of names next month. And when they all came back at the following board meeting, I've only been told this, but everybody only had one name, and that name was mine. And they all went around the table and they shared it. And then Pastor Dwight said that was my name. And then I heard later that Pastor Mark Denyes, the founder, also agreed. And so, which blew me away because I didn't see that coming. And so that led us back into the church. And then we went through about 8 months of transition before we actually stepped in March of 2013.
Yeah, it's such a great time. And I'm so grateful to be back. There is so many things that have happened in the last 10 years being at Emmanuel. Different challenges in the community with COVID and George Floyd and different things, leading a legacy church, how complicated that can be. There's so much to unpack here about being a shepherd-hearted leader. What do you think one of the greatest challenges are for people serving in ministry to have that shepherd heart?
One of the greatest challenges, well, first of all, is ourself. And where do we get our security from? If I am under authority, it's easier for me to be over others in authority. But if I'm not underneath, I'm not being shepherded myself, then it's really hard to turn around and shepherd others. And unfortunately, there are many, for various reasons, that are not under authority in their own heart. And then they feel the pressure to essentially be God to others underneath them, that they're responsible, they have to be perfect, that they have to do everything right, that any kind of criticism is going to bring the whole thing down. I think the biggest challenge is having that internal security between you and God. Yep. Not eternal security, internal security. Just to be able to say, you know what? I'm safe. If God has called me to do this, I can do everything. He's given me the strength to do it. And then figuring out how to partner with God in that and not let all the pressure be on yourself and allow God to be the one that truly is the shepherd. This is his church. Yep. These are his people. We're just under shepherds, under his leadership.
And I, like you always say, if you didn't claw to get it, you don't have to claw to keep it. Just
That's
knowing
right.
that God is the one who called us and he's going to equip us and give us everything we need.
That's right.
So can you explain to those who are listening what biblically is a shepherd-hearted leader?
What is a shepherd-hearted leader? And biblically is the big deal with that. You know, if you look at Genesis to Revelation, there's various metaphors for leadership that you will see. You'll see the body of Christ. You'll see the word head over the body of Christ, which is Jesus. You'll see various biographies of various people that are called to be kings and leaders and the like. But I think the dominant overarching view from God's standpoint is that of a shepherd. And so you'll see it over and over and over again. Abraham had flocks, and now he became more like a rancher. They had a lot of sub people overseeing his flocks, but he was a shepherd. And then you fast forward all the way through, even Moses was out in the wilderness taking care of sheep. He was a shepherd. And then you see the most famous one would be David in the Old Testament, where David watched over the flocks. And of course, even as a young boy, while he was watching over the flock, the story is told where Samuel comes to anoint the next king of Israel and goes to Jesse's household, who is David's dad, and goes through all the brothers, but none of them are good enough in God's sight. It's the guy that's out in the field taking care of sheep. And there's a famous passage in there, of course, where it says that man looks at the outward, but God looks at the heart. And so God sees shepherds and esteems shepherds. And so even Jesus would say, I am the good shepherd. So, I mean, trump that one, right? If he views himself as a shepherd and he's a leader, we're following him. That's what we would want to be. So biblically speaking, you see that language of a shepherd taking care of sheep, all the dynamics, of course, come into play in that. A shepherd, Psalm 23, David's psalm, leads the sheep to the water, leads the sheep through the valley of the shadow of death, leads them through, has leadership, feeding, cleaning up after them as a responsibility, all of those things. And then ultimately, when God looks at our performance, he judges shepherds in a particular way. I think it's Ezekiel 33:34, where God is looking at Israel, and at that point in time, a lot of the leaders, and that didn't just mean church leaders, but government leaders, people that were responsible for things in the nation of Israel at the time, had abandoned their responsibilities, and the people were going hungry, and the people were hurting, and there was the economy was shambles, if you will, and the leaders were okay. They were okay, and God speaks to those leaders, and he says, I have this against you, that you've fed yourself while your sheep go hungry, that you've not taken care of them. And so the prioritization of a shepherd leader in God's eyes is that he measures how the people under our care are doing. And so a shepherd-hearted leader is one in today's day and age where no matter what your responsibility is, no matter what you're doing, you could be the manager at McDonald's, you could be the manager of your home and you got children. It could be a lot, but if God were to look at you and the things and the people under your responsibility, he wouldn't just measure your success, he would measure the people's health underneath you. And that a shepherd-hearted leader doesn't think like a business leader or a leader that's going to use other people. A shepherd-hearted leader wants to take care of the people God has called you to lead.
Oh, that's really good. So powerful. Even just take a second and think about how impactful that is when we look at in today's society, a lot of people love to be called into leadership because they want to have some measure of success, to, get their programs or whatever they feel that they need to do, leading people from the front instead of, within the flock. I remember Pastor Dennis used to say that the shepherd should smell like sheep.
Yeah.
Like you should be around them enough to smell like them. Over the past several years, we've heard about a lot of leaders who have fallen from grace. People who, when you pull back the curtain, they were overlooking things. They weren't really caring for the sheep. And then there's a lot of damage. What do you think are some of the dangers pastors and leaders need to guard against within their own hearts so they don't become someone who's not a shepherd-hearted leader?
Well, this is a big topic. There's a whole podcast series around this. That I've listened to, and the scripture says, take heed lest you fall. So nobody's above falling. And I would just say, you use the phrase that's a common phrase, fallen from grace. We're never really falling from God's grace, but sometimes he allows us to be removed because we could hurt other people. And God will expose things, not because he's judging us totally and we're forever canceled, but because he cares about the flock, he'll remove a leader. And then that leader gets to go through their own journey of grace. So I think per the question about what are the things we need to be careful of and watch for, I'm especially attuned to younger leaders who desire to do great things. God puts dreams in their heart. They don't yet know how that's going to happen, but then they immediately look at who is getting celebrated right now. Who are the leaders and the pastors and the speakers and the communicators and the influencers that are getting the spotlight. And there's great power in notoriety and fame, because people think, well, if they're famous, wow, that's what I want to do, what they do, so I can be famous too.
Yeah, and this next generation really puts a lot into fame and being famous. Like,
well, it's modernized now. I mean,
super important.
I mean, there's actually, you get money from it. The more clicks you get, the more likes you get, the more follows you get, and all of that. So the challenge in that is, if the desire of your heart is to be esteemed, to be liked, and you do whatever it takes to get that, you can leave behind the whisper of God and the assignment from God somewhere along the way. And then you work so hard to get there. I talk to church planters, and church planting is not for the faint of heart. But if you plant a church, the hustle that you go through to get it off the ground, this personal sacrifice, the begging, the using people who aren't even saved yet to be a part of things, because you're going to use whatever you got. And the beauty of that story is people that wouldn't ordinarily go to church end up finding Jesus. And there's so many amazing things mixed in that. But then there's also some danger hidden in that, because once the church is off the ground, and you could parallel that with once your ministry is off the ground, once people know about you, now that things are moving along, it doesn't take as much energy to keep it moving. And then you can begin to settle into it being all about you. Narcissism becomes a part of that, where it's all about you. And then you could look at others as either people that will benefit you or a threat to take it away from you. And then it becomes all about you. And so I think that it's a dangerous thing to be in that mode, because now you're using people for your benefit instead of shepherding people for their benefit.
Wow.
And it's a pivot. It's actually away from the heartbeat of God. And the truth is, there's going to be pain either way. What goes up does come down, and people aren't going to be with you forever. I have a belief that I don't own the people that serve on our staff. I don't own their calling. That's Jesus. They're called to the voice. I am gifted with them being a steward while they're on our team. So, but what if they leave?
Yep.
Are you abandoning me?
No, sometimes it's hard though. You get attached
and
to these people.
if narcissism is at the core,
yeah,
then you will interpret anybody who leaves as they rejected you.
mm-hmm.
Instead of blessing them, you kind of withhold it. And I've watched leaders who they love people as long as they're with them and sacrificing with them, but as soon as they leave, they're dead to them.
Yeah,
and that shows they're not a shepherd-hearted leader.
So it's a lot of ego.
Yeah,
that plays
ego
into
gets in the
things.
way. People want the fame, and what if you don't get it? And the truth is, most people don't get it. Or there's always somebody that's more popular than you. There's always somebody that other people will follow. And and that's a matter of the heart. It's on the internal part of your world, and between you and God, you got to wrestle that out. If you hide it in your heart, you can become a Saul, where you end up throwing a spear at the Lord's anointed.
Oh, wow.
You could become something you used to never dream that you would become.
Yeah. So we'll wrap this part of our discussion up right now, but I just wanted to ask you probably one last thing is you talk about faithfulness versus famous. Maybe just touch on that and how can leaders keep narcissism out of their heart?
So faithfulness is the most esteemed character quality that you see that Jesus represents. When he talks about reward, he uses the words, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." So faithfulness does not mean famous. It may never be noticed. Faithfulness is just doing whatever God has called you to do. And so your target has to be obedience to whatever God wants me to do, not what others want me to do or what others will applaud or get celebrated. It's just doing what Jesus wants you to do. And so, I love the phrase that Pastor Benson taught me years ago, and that his definition of success is to accomplish God's goals in God's timing, and to stay true to that. If you're faithful, he rewards faithfulness. And I think the biggest thing that we can do is pursue that, not chase fame. Fame is fleeting. It's like grabbing a puff of smoke and there's nothing there at the end of it, or trying to move a wet noodle up a mirror. It's impossible. You're trying to do something that in the end isn't going to work. And I think if we could chase anything, let's just be faithful people. Lord, I just want to do what you called me to do and nothing else. And that's good enough for me.
That's so good. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights on being a shepherd-hearted leader. And I look forward to asking you more questions.